During World War II, more than 100 million men and women served in uniform across 6 continents. Every major army developed unique doctrines, weapons, and strategies that reflected their geography, industrial capacity, and political objectives. The question of which army was the most lethal depends on measurable factors: total enemy casualties inflicted, operational effectiveness, and the ratio between forces deployed and damage achieved. Between 1939 and 1945, 5 primary land forces dominated the conflict: the German Wehrmacht, the Soviet Red Army, the United States Army, the British Army, and the Imperial Japanese Army, each demonstrating distinct forms of lethality under different conditions. The German Wehrmacht combined speed, coordination, and precision in the early years of the war. Its doctrine of blitzkrieg enabled rapid victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, inflicting massive losses before opponents could fully mobilize. However, as the war expanded, the Wehrmacht's lethal efficiency declined under attrition and resource depletion. The Soviet Red Army evolved from near collapse in 1941 to the world's largest and most destructive land force by 1945. It inflicted the majority of German casualties, responsible for over 75% of Axis military deaths in Europe. The Red Army's combination of mass mobilization, artillery saturation, and relentless offensives transformed it into the decisive factor in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The United States Army entered the war later but brought unmatched industrial support, advanced logistics, and precision firepower. In both the European and Pacific theaters, its lethality was expressed through combined arms coordination, air, armor, and infantry, rather than sheer manpower. The U.S. Army's ability to project force globally made it the first truly mechanized expeditionary army in modern history. The British Army and Commonwealth forces maintained continuous engagement from 1939 to 1945, specializing in global warfare across Africa, Asia, and Europe. While smaller in scale, their contribution to total Axis losses was substantial, particularly in the Mediterranean and North African campaigns. The Imperial Japanese Army, though technologically inferior to Western powers, demonstrated high lethality through attritional land warfare in China and Southeast Asia, causing millions of enemy and civilian deaths. Determining which army was the most lethal requires examining operational records, casualty data, and the effectiveness of strategy, not ideology or moral judgment. The military lethality of each World War II army was not accidental. It resulted from pre-war doctrines, industrial capabilities, and national objectives shaped during the interwar period. Between 1919 and 1939, every major power analyzed the failures of World War I and adapted its strategy around different priorities: mobility, firepower, manpower, or technological innovation. The German Wehrmacht developed its doctrine from studies of operational depth and combined arms integration. The Reichswehr, limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men, emphasized officer education and staff efficiency rather than size. By the mid-1930s, under the leadership of generals such as Heinz Guderian, this approach evolved into Bugungskrieg, maneuver warfare, focusing on fast armored spearheads supported by mechanized infantry, close air support, and radio coordination. The goal was to destroy enemy formations through encirclement rather than attrition. This operational doctrine defined the Wehrmacht's lethal precision during the early campaigns in Europe. The Soviet Red Army, influenced by theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, pursued a doctrine of deep operations, aiming to penetrate multiple defensive lines simultaneously and destroy the enemy's command structure. However, Stalin's purges between 1937 and 1939 eliminated a large portion of the officer corps, damaging institutional knowledge. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army was unprepared for modern mobile warfare. Its subsequent recovery and later dominance were due to industrial relocation beyond the Ural Mountains, centralized production of tanks, such as the T-34, and mass conscription supported by political mobilization. The United States Army, demobilized after World War I, underwent modernization in the late 1930s. The adoption of the M1 Garand rifle, the Sherman tank, and motorized logistics established the foundation for a mechanized force. The U.S. doctrine emphasized firepower and coordination among infantry, armor, and air support. Unlike Germany or the USSR, American lethality was enabled by industrial scale. The United States produced over 41 billion rounds of ammunition and nearly 300,000 aircraft, enabling sustained high-intensity warfare across multiple theaters. The British Army maintained a global defense posture after World War I, prioritizing colonial policing over large-scale continental warfare. This left it initially under-mechanized and dispersed. The experience of Dunkirk and the North African campaigns forced adaptation toward combined arms and amphibious operations. British advances in radar, code-breaking, and special operations added technical lethality that compensated for limited manpower. The Imperial Japanese Army emphasized discipline, morale, and infantry assault tactics, rooted in pre-industrial traditions and limited mechanization. Japan's lethality derived from strategic surprise and local superiority rather than industrial capacity. The Army's campaigns in China and Southeast Asia relied on light infantry and jungle warfare tactics, but lacked the logistical depth required for sustained modern combat. By 1939, each army had entered the war with doctrines reflecting distinct interpretations of modern conflict. The differences in industrial resources, command structures, and operational philosophy would determine not only battlefield performance, but also the scale and efficiency of their lethality throughout the conflict. Between 1939 and 1942, the German Wehrmacht demonstrated the highest operational lethality among the major armies. Its coordinated use of armor, air power, and mobile infantry achieved rapid destruction of enemy forces in multiple campaigns. In Poland, September 1939, German and Soviet forces jointly invaded, dividing the country within 4 weeks. The Wehrmacht inflicted over 66,000 Polish military deaths and captured approximately 420,000 soldiers, losing fewer than 17,000 personnel in the process. The campaign confirmed the effectiveness of blitzkrieg as a doctrine of decisive warfare. In Western Europe, June 1940, the Wehrmacht launched Fallgelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Within 6 weeks, German forces destroyed or captured most of the French Army and British Expeditionary Force equipment. France suffered over 90,000 dead and 1.9 million prisoners. German losses totaled around 27,000. The lethality ratio demonstrated the Wehrmacht's operational superiority in maneuver warfare. However, the rapid victories depended on concentrated armored divisions, air superiority from the Luftwaffe, and the exploitation of command disorganization among the Allies. By contrast, the Soviet Red Army's initial performance in the Winter War against Finland, 1939 to 1940, exposed severe deficiencies in training and command structure. Soviet forces lost over 125,000 soldiers, while Finnish casualties were approximately 25,000. Despite eventual victory, the Red Army's lethality per engagement was low compared to the Wehrmacht's efficiency at the same period. The Imperial Japanese Army, operating independently from the Navy, maintained extensive ground campaigns in China since 1937. Between 1937 and 1942, Japanese forces inflicted high civilian and military casualties, estimated in the millions, due to prolonged occupation, siege tactics, and systematic destruction of Chinese infrastructure. In the initial months of the Pacific War, 1941 to 1942, Japanese land forces captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines, defeating Allied units numbering over 200,000 troops. Their lethality relied on strategic surprise, superior training, and coordination with naval air power. The British Army, recovering from the defeat in France, began rebuilding its strength in the Middle East. During the North African Campaign, 1940 to 1942, British Commonwealth forces achieved limited success against Italian divisions, but suffered reversals against the German Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel. British lethality improved through increased mechanization and the integration of intelligence support from code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park. The United States Army entered large-scale combat in 1942 with the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. Early operations revealed inexperience in combined arms warfare. However, American units quickly improved through coordination with British forces, standardization of logistics, and superior firepower deployment. By the end of 1942, lethality across the major armies diverged according to strategic conditions. The Wehrmacht demonstrated the highest efficiency in destroying enemy formations. The Japanese Army maintained dominance in the Pacific until overextended. The Red Army absorbed catastrophic losses but began its transformation into a mass-destructive force. The United States and Britain were transitioning from defensive to offensive warfare, preparing for global operations that would redefine military lethality in the years ahead. By 1943, the strategic balance of World War II shifted decisively. The early dominance of the Axis powers was replaced by sustained Allied offensives supported by overwhelming industrial capacity and coordinated military planning. During this period, the scale of lethality reached its peak, characterized by high-intensity operations involving millions of soldiers and vast logistical systems. The German Wehrmacht, still formidable, faced attrition on all fronts. The defeat at Stalingrad, February 1943, marked the end of its large-scale offensive capability in the East. Over 300,000 Axis troops were encircled, with approximately 90,000 captured and fewer than 6,000 surviving captivity. The Soviet Red Army's success demonstrated an evolved operational capability based on mass artillery fire, armor concentration, and strategic deception. During Operation Citadel, Kursk, July 1943, Germany launched its final major offensive in the East. The battle involved more than 6,000 tanks and 2 million soldiers. Soviet forces absorbed the attack, then counterattacked with superior numbers and coordination. The result was over 500,000 German casualties and the permanent loss of the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Between 1943 and 1944, the Red Army became the most lethal land force in the world by quantitative measures. It conducted successive operations: Bagration, Uranus, Kutuzov, and Lvov, Sandomierz, each inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties on German formations. Soviet artillery, averaging 250 guns per kilometer of front during major offensives, devastated Axis defensive lines. The Red Army's lethality derived from sheer scale, centralized command, and improved logistics, with Soviet industry producing over 57,000 tanks between 1943 and 1945. The United States Army, expanding across multiple theaters, achieved operational maturity through integration of technology and logistics. In the Pacific theater, American forces reversed Japanese advances through island-hopping campaigns such as Guadalcanal, 1942-43, Tarawa, 1943, and Saipan, 1944. U.S. Army and Marine units combined naval gunfire, air superiority, and mechanized infantry to inflict disproportionate losses. Japanese garrisons suffered near-total destruction in each engagement. In the European theater, the U.S. Army Air Forces executed strategic bombing campaigns against Germany, destroying industrial centers in Hamburg, Schweinfurt, and Dresden. By late 1944, American ground forces had crossed into France following the success of Operation Overlord, June 6, 1944, where more than 156,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy on the first day. The British Army, operating jointly with Commonwealth forces, advanced from North Africa into Italy in 1943. Its specialization in engineering, deception operations, and combined arms tactics proved critical to Allied coordination. British forces, though smaller than American or Soviet counterparts, contributed heavily to the destruction of Axis positions through sustained operations in Italy and later Northwest Europe. The Imperial Japanese Army, isolated by naval losses and cut from resources, entered strategic decline. In 1944, battles such as Leyte and Impol resulted in catastrophic casualties exceeding 400,000. Japanese tactics emphasized resistance to annihilation rather than tactical withdrawal, reducing strategic flexibility but increasing lethality at the unit level. By the end of 1944, the nature of lethality had shifted from maneuver-based warfare to total industrial conflict. The Red Army dominated by numbers, the U.S. by technological firepower, Germany by tactical efficiency despite collapse. The conflict's outcome was no longer determined by battlefield skill alone, but by industrial endurance and logistical superiority. Between late 1944 and mid-1945, the major armies of World War II reached the final phase of large-scale operations. The outcome of the conflict reflected a direct correlation between industrial endurance, manpower mobilization, and attrition rates. Each force demonstrated distinct patterns of lethality and loss during the closing campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. The German Wehrmacht, operating under severe logistical collapse, fought its final defensive operations on both the Eastern and Western fronts. In December 1944, the Ardennes Offensive, Battle of the Bulge, represented the last German attempt to reverse the tide in the West. Approximately 450,000 German troops engaged 600,000 Allied personnel. Initial success resulted in temporary advances, but fuel shortages and Allied air superiority halted progress. German losses totaled around 100,000 men, including killed, wounded, and captured, compared to 81,000 Allied casualties. After this operation, Germany was unable to mount another strategic offensive. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army advanced on a 2,000-kilometer front during Operation Bagration, August 1944, annihilating Army Group Center and inflicting over 450,000 German casualties. The subsequent Vistula, Oder, and Berlin offensives, May 1945, completed the destruction of the Wehrmacht. In the final assault on Berlin, more than 2.5 million Soviet troops faced approximately 750,000 German defenders. Soviet losses exceeded 80,000 killed and 275,000 wounded, while German military and civilian deaths in the city were estimated between 150,000 and 200,000. By May 8, 1945, the Wehrmacht surrendered unconditionally. The United States Army, supported by Allied air and naval power, achieved full operational dominance. In Europe, U.S. forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and advanced into central Germany. By war's end, total U.S. Army ground casualties in the European theater numbered approximately 783,000, including 195,000 killed. In the Pacific, the island campaigns of Iwo Jima, March 1945, and Okinawa, June 1945, displayed extreme lethality on both sides. At Okinawa, 12,500 Americans were killed, while Japanese forces lost over 100,000. Civilian deaths exceeded 150,000. These operations demonstrated the intensity of resistance expected in a mainland invasion of Japan. The British Army and Commonwealth forces participated in the final European offensives, liberating the Netherlands and northern Germany. British losses from 1939 to 1945 totaled approximately 382,000 killed across all services. In Asia, British and Indian divisions defeated Japanese forces in Burma through Operation Dracula and Operation Zipper, restoring Allied control of Southeast Asia by mid-1945. The Imperial Japanese Army faced near-total destruction. Isolated garrisons across the Pacific continued fighting after losing communication with Central Command. By mid-1945, Japan's capacity to sustain warfare had collapsed under blockade and bombardment. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9th, caused an estimated 120,000 immediate deaths, with additional casualties from radiation exposure. Following the Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 9th, Japanese forces in Asia, over 1.3 million men, were defeated within weeks. Japan announced surrender on August 15, 1945. By war's end, global military deaths exceeded 25 million. The Red Army inflicted the majority of Axis casualties, while the United States combined industrial firepower and global reach to conclude the conflict. The Wehrmacht, once the most efficient force, was destroyed through attrition. The correlation between industrial capacity and sustained lethality defined the final outcome of the war. Following the surrender of Germany and Japan in 1945, analysts from all major powers began assessing the comparative effectiveness and lethality of the armies that had fought the Second World War. The evaluation was based on measurable criteria: enemy losses inflicted, operational success per engagement, casualty ratios, and sustainability under prolonged combat conditions. Statistical evidence established that the Soviet Red Army inflicted the greatest number of Axis military casualties. Between 1941 and 1945, it destroyed or captured approximately 607 German divisions, representing around three-quarters of all German military losses. Soviet combat deaths are estimated at 8.6 million, with total military and civilian losses exceeding 26 million. Despite immense cost, the Red Army's combination of numerical superiority, industrial relocation, and tactical adaptation transformed it into the most destructive ground force in modern history. Its post-war doctrine emphasized operational depth, mechanized maneuver, and massed artillery, concepts that defined Soviet military power throughout the Cold War. The German Wehrmacht, although ultimately defeated, retained a reputation for tactical efficiency. Studies conducted by Allied military historians after 1945, including the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office, concluded that German formations consistently achieved higher kill ratios in local engagements due to superior small unit training and decentralized command, Auftragstaktik. However, Germany's inability to sustain industrial output, maintain fuel supplies, or replace experienced personnel nullified its tactical advantages. By 1945, the Wehrmacht's operational lethality had declined by over 70% compared to its 1940 peak. The United States Army emerged as the most technologically integrated and logistically capable military force. It demonstrated the highest strategic lethality, the ability to project decisive force across global theaters. American industry produced over 88,000 tanks, 324,000 aircraft, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition during the war. The combination of precision bombing, mechanized mobility, and air-ground coordination established the model for post-war warfare. U.S. casualty ratios, approximately 1 killed for every 40 enemy combatants neutralized, reflected efficiency driven by firepower rather than manpower. The British Army and Commonwealth forces contributed to the overall Allied lethality through global deployment and specialization in amphibious, intelligence, and engineering operations. British doctrine after the war emphasized flexibility and coalition warfare, derived from experiences in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. The Imperial Japanese Army, though initially effective in regional campaigns, ended the war largely destroyed. Its reliance on infantry assault tactics and rejection of mechanization resulted in unsustainable losses. Post-war analyses by both Japanese and Allied commissions identified the lack of industrial depth and overextension as the primary causes of strategic failure. In quantitative terms, the Second World War represented the most lethal conflict in human history. Total deaths, including civilian casualties, are estimated between 70 and 85 million. The Red Army was responsible for the highest number of enemy combat losses. The Wehrmacht exhibited the greatest early war efficiency, and the United States demonstrated unmatched global lethality through technology and logistics. The legacy of these forces reshaped post-war military doctrine. The Soviet Union built a continental superarmy based on massed firepower, while the United States pursued global reach through mechanization and nuclear capability. Germany's tactical methods influenced NATO training systems, and Japan's defeat led to a constitutional renunciation of offensive warfare. The comparative study of their lethality remains central to understanding modern military science and the transformation of warfare in the 20th century.